I came home late that night, tired from another grueling day at the office. The house was quiet, the kids already in bed. Sarah was on the couch, her phone in hand, barely glancing up to acknowledge me. Something about her posture felt off. She seemed overly focused, her fingers flying across the screen. "Who are you texting?" I asked casually, trying to sound more curious than suspicious. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before smiling and saying, "Oh, just Emily from work. We're planning a lunch outing next week." Her answer should have been enough to quiet my thoughts, but that hesitation stuck with me. It wasn't like her. Sarah had always been quick with her words. Too quick, sometimes. But this time, something wasn't right. Later that night, while she was showering, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't even think about snooping, but a feeling I couldn't ignore pushed me toward it. The screen lit up with a notification. "Miss you already." My heart stopped. That single message hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands shook as I unlocked her phone. She'd never changed the password. What I found wasn't just one message. It was an entire thread, a back and forth filled with inside jokes, pet names, and plans to meet up. The man's name was Mark, someone I didn't even recognize. They'd met for lunch last week, but the tone of the messages made it clear it wasn't just about grabbing a bite to eat. By the time Sarah came back into the room, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in my hand. She froze, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "What's this, Sarah?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep control. Her eyes darted from me to the phone. "Mike, it's nothing. Just a friend from work. Just a friend." I tossed the phone onto the bed, open to the incriminating messages. "Does this look like just a friend to you?" Her face flushed, and for a second, I thought she might actually try to deny it. But then she sighed and sank into the chair in the corner of the room. "It was a mistake," she said quietly, barely meeting my eyes. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice rising. "How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" She wouldn't answer at first. I stood there, waiting, my anger building with every passing second. Finally, she whispered, "A few months." My chest tightened. A few months. While I'd been working late, helping with the kids, keeping our lives together, she'd been sneaking around behind my back. I wanted to scream, to break something, but the only thing I could do was sit back down and put my head in my hands. "Why, Sarah? What did I do to deserve this?" She didn't answer, just sat there in silence. That silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. And just like that, the foundation of our marriage, the life I thought we'd built together, started to crack. The days that followed were a blur of anger, confusion, and pain. I couldn't look at Sarah without feeling the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages, those words meant for someone else. They played in my head like a broken record, tearing at me with every repetition. At first, I thought I'd leave right away. I even packed a bag late one night while Sarah was asleep, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made it as far as the front door before stopping, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. The thought of my kids waking up the next morning and finding me gone made my stomach churn. They didn't deserve that. Not after everything. I stayed, but it wasn't for Sarah. It was for them. The atmosphere in the house shifted almost immediately. I tried to act normal for the kids, forcing smiles and making sure they didn't sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. But it wasn't easy. Every interaction with Sarah felt like stepping on broken glass. She kept her distance, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. Her guilt was obvious, but instead of apologizing, she seemed to retreat into herself, as if shutting me out could somehow erase what she'd done. The tension seeped into every corner of our lives. Mealtimes were quiet, almost unbearably so. I'd sit at the table with the kids, watching them laugh and chatter about school, while Sarah barely touched her food. I wondered if they noticed the shift, if they could sense the undercurrent of resentment and distrust between their parents. One night, as I tucked our youngest into bed, she asked me if everything was okay. Her small voice broke something in me, and I had to turn away for a moment to keep from crying. I told her everything was fine, that Mommy and Daddy were just tired. But even as I said it, I felt like I was lying to both of us. The arguments with Sarah were inevitable, though we tried to keep them quiet. She insisted the affair was a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything. But her words felt hollow, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. And then there were the accusations. She claimed I'd been distant, too focused on work, not attentive enough. It felt like she was trying to shift the blame, as if her betrayal was somehow my fault. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Had I worked long hours? Yes. But wasn't that for our family, for her and the kids? I'd thought I was doing the right thing, sacrificing my time to give us a better life. Now, it felt like all of it had been for nothing. There were nights I couldn't sleep, the anger and sadness keeping me awake. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the darkened windows, wondering where I'd gone wrong. The love I'd once felt for Sarah was still there, buried beneath the pain, but it was tangled up with bitterness and betrayal. I didn't know if I could ever untangle it again. Through it all, I kept going, putting one foot in front of the other for the sake of the kids. They were my anchor, the only thing keeping me from being swept away by the storm. But deep down, I knew the damage had been done. The life I thought we had, the marriage I'd believed in, it was all just a facade, crumbling before my eyes. After the initial shock subsided, I suggested we try counseling. It wasn't for Sarah, it wasn't even for me, really. It was for the kids, for the sake of preserving some semblance of stability in their lives. I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, sitting in a room with a professional might help us make sense of what had happened. Sarah agreed, though her reluctance was palpable. Her compliance felt more like an obligation than a genuine desire to repair what was broken. She seemed to think attending sessions was enough, as if her mere presence would prove she was making an effort. The first few sessions were agonizing. Sitting across from Sarah in that sterile room, with the counselor calmly asking us to share our feelings, felt surreal. Sarah spoke about her mistake in vague, detached terms, never truly acknowledging the gravity of what she had done. She painted herself as a victim of circumstances, stressed, overwhelmed, and underappreciated. Hearing her twist the narrative was maddening. I sat there, biting my tongue, as she spoke about how she'd felt neglected, how I'd been too focused on work to notice her needs. It was as though she was trying to justify her betrayal, to rationalize it in a way that made her seem blameless. When it was my turn to speak, I struggled to find the right words. How could I explain the depth of my hurt, my anger, my disillusionment? Every time I tried, it felt like Sarah brushed it aside, as if my feelings were an inconvenience to her. The counselor suggested we focus on rebuilding trust, but how could I rebuild something when the foundation had been so thoroughly shattered? Over time, the sessions became a pattern. Sarah would talk about her perceived grievances, about how she had felt pushed away by my long hours and emotional distance. I'd try to respond, to explain that everything I had done, every late night, every sacrifice, was for her and the kids. But no matter what I said, it felt like we were speaking different languages. There were moments when I caught the counselor giving me a sympathetic look, as if she could see through Sarah's excuses. But sympathy didn't change anything. I kept waiting for Sarah to take responsibility, to show genuine remorse, but it never came. Instead, she seemed more focused on proving why she wasn't entirely at fault. One session, the counselor asked us to reflect on what we wanted for the future. Sarah said she wanted to move past the affair, to rebuild our marriage and return to normal. Hearing her say that made me realize how fundamentally different our perspectives were. For her, this was just a bump in the road, something to get over. For me, it was an earthquake that had torn our lives apart. By the time the counseling sessions ended, I was more disillusioned than ever. The process hadn't brought us closer. If anything, it had only highlighted how far apart we really were. Sarah's inability, or unwillingness, to fully own her actions left me feeling stuck, as if I were the only one truly grappling with what had happened. I left the final session knowing one thing for certain. Whatever chance we might have had at saving our marriage was slipping away. The distance between us had become insurmountable, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength, or the desire, to keep fighting for something that felt so irreparably broken. Life after counseling settled into an uneasy rhythm. The sessions had done little to repair the damage, but we fell into a pattern that felt more like cohabitation than marriage. Sarah and I spoke only when necessary, and when we did, our conversations were short and transactional. The warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by a cold politeness that barely masked the resentment simmering beneath the surface. The years blurred together, marked not by love or connection but by routine. I poured everything I had into being a father, throwing myself into the kids' lives as a way to escape the emptiness of my marriage. I coached their soccer games, attended parent-teacher conferences, and made sure they never missed a birthday celebration. I wanted them to feel secure, to know they were loved, even if their parents could no longer provide an example of a healthy relationship. Sarah, for her part, tried to maintain the image of a devoted mother, but even the kids seemed to sense something was off. They noticed the way we avoided each other, the strained silences that filled the house. I could see it in the way they hesitated before asking if Mommy and Daddy could come to their school events together. I never let them down, but every shared event with Sarah felt like a performance, a carefully choreographed act for the sake of appearances. What hurt the most were the lies. They weren't as bold as her initial betrayal, but they were there, chipping away at what little trust remained. She'd lie about small things, a lunch date with a friend, a late meeting at work. I stopped confronting her after a while. It wasn't worth the emotional toll. But every lie, no matter how insignificant, was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. There were moments when I wondered why I stayed. The anger and sadness would creep in during the quiet hours of the night, and I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the past in my mind. But every time I thought about leaving, I'd picture the kids, their laughter, their milestones, the way they looked at me with trust and love. I couldn't bring myself to shatter their world, not while they were still so young. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed content to exist in this hollow version of our marriage. She went about her life as if nothing had changed, focusing on her own needs while I shouldered the emotional burden. She never apologized again, never showed any real remorse. It was as if she believed time alone could heal the wounds she'd caused. I tried to find solace in other areas of my life. My work, my hobbies, but everything felt tainted by the weight of the marriage I was trapped in. Friends and family started to notice the change in me, though I rarely spoke about what had happened. I couldn't bear the thought of explaining it, of admitting how far we'd fallen. As the years went on, I became an expert at pretending. I learned to smile at family gatherings, to laugh at jokes, to act as though everything was fine. But inside, I was counting the days until the kids were grown, until I could finally walk away without guilt. The worst part was realizing how much of myself I'd lost. The man I used to be, the man who believed in love, in trust, in building a life together, felt like a distant memory. In his place was someone hardened by betrayal, someone who had learned to survive by keeping his walls up. I didn't recognize myself anymore, and I didn't recognize Sarah, either. Whatever love we'd once shared had been buried under years of resentment and disappointment. We were two strangers sharing a house, bound together only by our children and the ghosts of the life we'd once imagined. The day finally came when our youngest packed up his things and headed off to college. It was a bittersweet moment, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you've been climbing toward it for years. I hugged him tightly, holding back the tears that came more from relief than sadness. He had his whole life ahead of him now, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I felt like my own life was finally mine to reclaim. The house was quiet after he left, a silence so profound it was almost oppressive. I sat in his empty room for a while, letting the reality of the moment sink in. There were no more soccer practices to coach, no science projects to help with, no nightly check-ins to make sure homework was done. The role that had defined me for so long, father, provider, protector, was shifting. Sarah, as usual, seemed unfazed. She made a few passing remarks about how proud she was of him, but then retreated into her routines without much acknowledgement of how monumental this moment was. I watched her flit around the house, organizing things that didn't need organizing, avoiding any meaningful conversation. For years, I had stayed because of the kids. I had sacrificed my happiness, my sense of self, to give them a stable home. But now, with the house feeling emptier than ever, I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. There was nothing left to keep me here. The days that followed were a haze of planning and reflection. I started making lists, what I would need to pack, where I might go, how to handle the financial logistics of separating from Sarah. I kept my plans quiet, not out of fear, but because I wanted to approach this with as little conflict as possible. After everything, I didn't have the energy for another battle. I spent a lot of time thinking about the man I used to be, the man who had once believed in the sanctity of marriage, in building a life with someone you loved. That man felt like a stranger to me now. I'd spent so many years suppressing my feelings, pretending everything was fine, that I wasn't sure who I was anymore. But one thing was clear. Staying in this marriage was no longer an option. The thought of spending the rest of my life in the same house as Sarah, pretending to be something we weren't, was unbearable. I wanted more, for myself, for whatever future I still had left. The night before I planned to tell Sarah, I sat on the porch with a drink in my hand, staring at the stars. It was a clear, quiet night, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm. The fear and guilt that had kept me tethered to this broken marriage were slipping away, replaced by a quiet determination. I thought about the kids, about how they might react. I knew it wouldn't be easy for them, even now that they were older. But I also knew they'd seen the cracks in our marriage for years. Maybe, in time, they'd understand why I had to leave. As I finished my drink and headed back inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for a life where I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells, where I could wake up each morning without the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I was ready to take the first step. The morning I decided to tell Sarah was like any other, ordinary and uneventful. The coffee pot gurgled as it brewed, and sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting soft shadows on the counter. It felt strange, surreal almost, that such a significant moment could begin in such a mundane way. I sat at the table, the same place where we'd once shared countless meals and conversations about everything from weekend plans to our children's milestones. But those days felt like a distant memory, a life that belonged to someone else. Sarah entered the kitchen, her steps light, her gaze drifting past me as though I were just another piece of furniture. She was scrolling through her phone, her expression indifferent. For a fleeting second, I thought about staying silent, about letting the moment pass and slipping back into the safety of routine. But I knew I couldn't. Not this time. When I told her I needed to talk, her reaction was predictable. She sighed, placing her phone down with an air of annoyance. This had become her default mode: disinterest, irritation, anything but vulnerability. I laid everything out in as calm a manner as I could manage. I told her that the kids were grown now, that I'd fulfilled my duty as a father to provide them with a stable home, and that I could no longer stay in a marriage that had been hollow for so long. She didn't interrupt, not at first. She just sat there, her eyes narrowing as my words sank in. But as soon as I mentioned the word divorce, her demeanor changed. Her calm facade cracked, and the familiar storm of anger and deflection came roaring back. She accused me of being selfish, of abandoning the family, of giving up. She claimed I was overreacting, that every marriage went through rough patches, and that leaving now, after all these years, was cruel. It was like she was reading from a script, repeating the same lines she'd used during counseling. But I wasn't the same man I'd been back then. Her words didn't sting the way they once would have. Instead, they washed over me, empty and weightless. What struck me most wasn't her anger but her complete lack of accountability. Even after all these years, she still couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the role she'd played in the unraveling of our marriage. To her, I was the problem, the one who was too rigid, too focused on the past, too unwilling to move on. It was as if she had rewritten history in her mind, casting herself as the victim and me as the antagonist. The argument lasted for hours, dragging on into the afternoon. At one point, she shifted tactics, trading anger for manipulation. She brought up the kids, trying to guilt me into staying. She told me I was being selfish, that our family would never be the same, that I was risking everything we'd built together. But I'd already made my decision. 4 years, I'd been sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of the family, for the kids, for a version of marriage that no longer existed. I had given and given until there was nothing left of me, and I wasn't willing to lose any more. By the time the dust settled, Sarah was exhausted, and so was I. She retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I sat there for a long time, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee on the table, the silence of the house pressing down on me. That night, I started packing. I didn't take much, just the essentials. A few clothes, personal documents, and the little things that reminded me of who I used to be. A worn paperback novel I'd loved in college, an old photo of me with the kids at the beach, a watch my father had given me. I didn't feel sadness or regret as I packed. Instead, I felt an odd sense of relief, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying was finally being lifted. The next morning, I told the kids. I kept it simple, explaining that their mother and I had decided to go our separate ways but that we both loved them and would always be there for them. They took the news as well as I could have hoped. There were tears, of course, and questions I couldn't fully answer, but I could tell they weren't entirely surprised. They'd seen the cracks in our marriage for years, even if we'd tried to shield them from it. Leaving the house felt like walking away from a battlefield. The scars of what had happened there, of what had been lost, would always stay with me. But as I closed the door behind me and stepped out into the crisp morning air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. I didn't have a grand plan or a clear vision of what my life would look like now. I just knew I couldn't keep living in the shadows of betrayal and resentment. I had spent too long trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed, and it was time to start focusing on myself. Driving away, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, the road ahead felt open, full of possibility. Starting over at my age wasn't easy. After leaving, I found a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a modest living room, and a kitchen that could barely fit a table, but it was mine. The silence of the place was overwhelming at first. For years, I had lived in a house filled with the sounds of kids laughing, doors slamming, and the constant hum of family life. Now, the only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator. The first few weeks were the hardest. I didn't realize how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being a husband and a father until those roles were stripped down to their core. Without the daily routines of family life to ground me, I felt unmoored. There were mornings I woke up expecting to hear the kids arguing over cereal or Sarah bustling around the kitchen. Instead, I was met with quiet and the pale light filtering through the blinds. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and longer hours to fill the void. It helped, but only to a point. Evenings were the worst. The apartment, small as it was, felt cavernous in its emptiness. I started going for long walks after dinner, winding through the quiet streets and letting my thoughts drift. Eventually, I began to rebuild. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, just small steps forward. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during the years of my marriage. At first, it was awkward, explaining what had happened and why I'd stayed so long. But I was surprised by how understanding most of them were. They didn't judge me for the choices I'd made, they just listened, offering quiet support. I also started picking up hobbies I'd abandoned long ago. I dusted off my guitar, one I hadn't played since before the kids were born, and spent evenings relearning chords and melodies. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a reminder of the man I used to be. Seeing the kids was my lifeline. We worked out a schedule that allowed me to spend weekends with them. They'd come over, filling the apartment with laughter and energy that reminded me why I'd held on for so long. We'd cook meals together, watch movies, and talk late into the night. They never asked for details about the separation, and I didn't volunteer them. I wanted them to feel safe, to know that both Sarah and I were still there for them, even if we weren't together. Over time, the awkwardness faded, replaced by a new normal. The kids seemed to understand that I was happier now, even if they didn't fully grasp the reasons why. I cherished those weekends, holding on to them like a lifeline. Sarah and I communicated only when necessary, mostly about the kids. Her tone was curt, her words clipped, but I didn't mind. I had spent enough years walking on eggshells around her. I wasn't going to let her bitterness seep into this new chapter of my life. One day, I stumbled across an old photo album while unpacking a box I'd brought from the house. Flipping through the pages, I saw images of Sarah and me in the early days, our wedding, vacations, birthdays. I didn't feel anger or sadness looking at them, just a quiet sense of detachment. That life felt like it belonged to someone else, a younger version of me who hadn't yet learned how fragile love and trust could be. As the months passed, I began to find joy in the little things. I took day trips to nearby parks, went to live music events, and even joined a local book club. It felt strange at first, stepping out of my comfort zone, but it also felt good. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. There were still hard days, of course. The scars of betrayal don't fade overnight, and there were moments when the weight of everything I'd been through felt unbearable. But those moments became fewer and farther between. One evening, while sitting on my small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized something. I was at peace. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that I'd made the right choice. Enough to believe that the future held more than just pain and regret. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a life I could call my own. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Years passed, and with time, the wounds left by Sarah's betrayal began to fade, though they never disappeared completely. They became scars, faint but visible, reminders of a chapter of my life that had tested me in ways I never thought possible. But life, as it tends to do, moved forward. The kids grew into adults, carving out their own paths in the world. Watching them flourish was my greatest joy. My oldest became a teacher, following her passion for helping others. My middle child pursued a career in engineering, and my youngest, the one whose departure for college had signaled the beginning of my freedom, surprised us all by becoming an artist. I saw pieces of myself in each of them, and knowing I had played a role in shaping the people they'd become made every sacrifice worth it. Being a grandfather brought a new kind of happiness. The first time I held my granddaughter, a tiny bundle with big curious eyes, I felt something shift in me. It was as if the pieces of my heart that had been broken so long ago were being stitched together, one gentle beat at a time. I spent hours with her, rocking her to sleep, singing lullabies, and marveling at the way she looked at the world with unfiltered wonder. As more grandchildren came, my weekends became a whirlwind of games, laughter, and the kind of chaos that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep our family together all those years ago. They gave me purpose, a reason to keep going, even on the days when the memories of the past threatened to pull me under. Sarah and I maintained a civil relationship for the sake of the kids, but we were no more than acquaintances by then. She remarried a few years after the divorce, and while I wished her no ill will, I felt nothing when I heard the news. Our lives had diverged so completely that she was little more than a figure from my past. As for me, I found contentment in simplicity. My days were filled with small joys, early morning walks, afternoons spent tending to a modest garden, evenings reading by the fire. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a community that supported me in ways I hadn't known I needed. I never remarried. It wasn't for lack of opportunity. There were women who came into my life over the years, some who even offered me love and companionship. But after everything I'd been through, I realized I didn't need a partner to feel whole. My happiness wasn't tied to someone else. It was something I'd learned to cultivate within myself. There were quiet moments when I reflected on the life I'd lived, on the choices I'd made and the path that had brought me here. I thought about the younger version of myself, the man who had once believed in fairy tale endings, in the idea that love could conquer all. He wouldn't recognize me now, and I wasn't sure if he'd admire the man I'd become or pity him. But as I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Not for the pain or the betrayal, but for the resilience that had carried me through it. For the love of my children, for the moments of joy that had made the struggle worthwhile, and for the peace I had finally found. In the end, my story wasn't about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about endurance, about the ability to keep moving forward even when the road seemed impossibly hard. It was about finding meaning in the things that truly mattered: family, self-respect, and the quiet beauty of a life well lived. And as I looked at the stars, I realized something. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me or by the mistakes of others. I was defined by what I chose to do next, by the life I chose to build from the ashes. And for that, I was finally at peace.